What would you do if, in the dead of night, you found a creature with glowing pink eyes as big as flashlights staring back at you? A creature with 3 legs, stubby arms, and an unearthly presence. Would you run, hide, or, like Henry McDaniel, would you stand and face the unknown? This is the story of the Enfield Monster, a mysterious figure that haunted a small town in Illinois in 1973. To this day, no one knows exactly what it was. But one thing is certain, whatever it wasn't from around here. April 25th, 1973. The small, sleepy town of Enfield, Illinois, lay under a blanket of quiet darkness. Life here moved slowly. Families tucked themselves in early, with only the hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a stray dog breaking the silence. But on this particular night, something unusual stirred, something that would change the town forever. Henry McDaniel, a hard-working father, was winding down after a typical day. Dinner was done, the dishes put away, and the house was settling into its nighttime rhythm. His wife flipped through the pages of a well-read book in the living room, while their children's laughter echoed faintly upstairs. Everything seemed ordinary, until it wasn't. It started with a noise, a sound so faint, it barely registered at first. Henry, seated near the front window, glanced up from his paper. He tilted his head, listening. A moment passed. Nothing. He shrugged it off, convinced it was nothing more than the wind brushing against the screen door. But as he returned to his reading, the noise came again, this time louder, more deliberate. Henry lowered his paper. This wasn't the wind. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on the front door. "What's that?" his wife asked, her voice tinged with unease. Henry waved her off, though he couldn't hide the furrow in his brow. He stood up, moving toward the door, his steps slow and cautious. His heart thudded in his chest, but he told himself it was nothing to worry about. Maybe a stray dog or a raccoon scavenging for food. It wouldn't be the first time. But as he reached for the doorknob, a strange chill ran down his spine. Henry hesitated. Something felt wrong. His fingers hovered over the knob for a moment before he tightened his grip and pulled the door open. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. There, standing just beyond the porch light, was a figure unlike anything he'd ever seen. It had 3 legs, Henry would later tell reporters, his voice trembling at the memory. A short body, 2 little arms, and its eyes. They were pink and as big as flashlights. The creature's outline was jagged and unnatural, as though its very existence defied logic. Its legs were oddly spaced, giving it a lurching, off-balance stance. The stubby arms twitched at its sides, moving in short, erratic bursts. And those eyes, they pierced through the darkness, glowing with an intensity that seemed to cut straight through to Henry's core. Henry froze. His mind raced, struggling to process what he was seeing. Was it some kind of animal? A deformity of nature? Or was it something else entirely? The creature didn't move at first. It simply stared at him, its glowing eyes unblinking. Then, with a sudden jerk, it shifted its weight, its movements sharp and unnatural, almost insect-like. Henry slammed the door shut with a force that rattled the windows. "What is it?" His wife called out from the other room, her voice rising in alarm. Henry didn't answer. His hands trembled as he locked the door, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear any sign that the creature had left. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, it was back. The sound of claws scraping against the wood was relentless, like nails on a chalkboard. Henry stumbled back, his eyes darting around the room for something, anything, that he could use to protect his family. He grabbed a flashlight from a nearby table and held it tightly, his knuckles white. Henry's wife appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Stay back," he told her. "Take the kids upstairs and lock the door." "But just do it," he barked, his voice sharper than he intended. She hesitated for a moment before nodding and disappearing up the stairs. Henry turned back to the door, his grip on the flashlight tightening. The scratching had stopped again, replaced by an eerie silence. But silence can be just as terrifying as noise. Henry crept to the window, careful to stay out of view. He pulled the curtain back just a fraction, peering out into the darkness. First, he saw nothing. The yard was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, in the corner of his vision, he saw it. The creature was moving along the side of the house, its movements jerky and uneven. It stopped at one of the windows, its head tilting as though it were listening for something. Henry's breath caught in his throat. It turned its head slowly, its glowing pink eyes locking onto the window where Henry stood. And then, it smiled. That night was just the beginning. The scratching didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. Each sound seemed to rattle the very walls of the house, shaking Henry's nerves to their core. His hands trembled as he reached for his .22 pistol, a weapon he kept tucked away for emergencies. This wasn't the kind of emergency he'd ever prepared for, but in that moment, there was no time to second-guess. The safety clicked off with a sound that echoed through the tense silence of the room. Henry's wife and children huddled upstairs, their whispered prayers barely audible over the relentless banging at the door. He opened the door, just enough to see what was out there. And there it was, the creature. It hadn't left. It was still there, its glowing pink eyes glaring at him, its grotesque form illuminated by the faint porch light. The sight sent a chill down Henry's spine, but he steeled himself, aiming the pistol directly at the thing's twisted figure. For shots rang out in the quiet night. Henry watched as the bullets struck their target. For a brief moment, he thought he'd ended the nightmare. But then something happened that made his heart drop. The creature didn't fall. Instead, it recoiled slightly, as if the bullets were little more than an annoyance. Then, with an almost deliberate slowness, it turned its head toward him. Its glowing eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Henry felt something worse than fear. It was as if the creature was mocking him. Then, without warning, it moved. The creature bounded across the yard, its movements unnatural and otherworldly. Henry stood frozen in the doorway, watching as it leaped into the darkness, covering an astonishing 75 feet in just 3 jumps. It was gone. Or so he thought. When the sun rose the next morning, Henry's yard was eerily quiet. The events of the night felt almost like a fever dream, but the evidence left behind was impossible to ignore. Henry called the local authorities, his voice steady but urgent. When the police arrived, they didn't know what to expect. Reports of strange creatures weren't exactly commonplace in Enfield, Illinois. The officers examined the yard carefully. The first thing they noticed was the door. Deep scratches marred the surface of the screen, as though something with claws had tried to tear its way inside. The scratches were uneven and jagged, suggesting a creature with incredible strength or a desperate determination to get in. But it was the footprints that truly left the officers baffled. The tracks were unlike anything they'd ever seen. They resembled a dog's prints, but there were 6 toes on each foot, and the spacing was off. The prints suggested a creature that was large, heavy, and abnormal. The officers measured the tracks, taking detailed notes. They followed them as far as they could, but the trail abruptly ended near the edge of the property. It was as if the creature had simply vanished into thin air. Could this creature have been some kind of undiscovered animal? Henry didn't think so. He was convinced this thing wasn't from Earth. It wasn't like anything we've got around here, he told the officers. If you find it, you'll see for yourself. And when you do, I promise you, you'll find more than one. His words sent a shiver down the spine of everyone present. The officers left the property with more questions than answers. They filed their report, noting the unusual details, but there was no follow-up investigation. To the authorities, it was just another strange story in a quiet town. a story that would likely fade with time. But for Henry McDaniel, it wasn't over. That night, Henry sat by the window, unable to sleep. Every creak of the house made him jump. Every shadow outside seemed to shift and move. And then, just before midnight, he heard it again. Henry's blood ran cold. He clutched his pistol tightly, his knuckles white. The scratching turned into banging once more, as if the creature was taunting him, daring him to come outside. Henry stayed inside this time, watching from the window. What he saw chilled him to his core. The creature was back, and it wasn't alone. Two smaller figures emerged from the darkness, their movements just as erratic and unsettling as the first. The three of them stood in the yard, their glowing eyes fixed on the house. Henry didn't move. He didn't breathe. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, bounding away into the night. The events of that night were just the beginning. By the morning after Henry McDaniel's chilling encounter, the quiet town of Enfield, Illinois, was buzzing with whispers. News traveled fast in small communities, and in Enfield, anything out of the ordinary was bound to catch fire. At first, people didn't believe it. The idea of a three-legged creature with glowing pink eyes sounded absurd, like something out of a wild tall tale. But for those who knew Henry, this was no laughing matter. Henry McDaniel wasn't the type to spin yarns or seek attention. He was a quiet, no-nonsense man, a veteran and a family man. If Henry said he saw something, then, well, maybe he did. And then came the second story. Just hours before Henry's encounter, a young boy named Greg Garrett had been playing in his backyard. Greg lived less than 2 blocks from the McDaniel home. It was early evening, and the sun had just begun to set. According to Greg, he was playing with his dog when he noticed something strange out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, but when he turned to look, his heart nearly stopped. There it was, the same creature Henry would later describe. A short body, stubby arms, and glowing pink eyes. But Greg noticed something else. He said the creature's skin looked rough, almost like scales, and its movements were jerky, as though it wasn't used to walking on Earth. Greg didn't have time to think. The creature lunged at him. Greg screamed as the thing stomped on his feet, its weight pressing down so hard it tore his shoes apart. His dog barked furiously, snapping at the air, but the creature seemed unfazed. Greg ran inside, slamming the door behind him. By the time his parents came to see what was wrong, the creature had vanished. 2 sightings. One night. Could they both be lying? Or was something truly stalking the small town of Enfield? Greg's story added fuel to the fire. It wasn't just one man's word anymore. There was a pattern, a timeline, a growing sense of fear spreading through the community. Neighbors started sharing their own strange experiences. Some claimed they'd heard odd sounds at night. Scratching, banging, even unearthly growls. Others said they'd seen strange shapes in the shadows or glowing eyes peering out from the woods. But there were those who weren't so quick to believe. Skeptics laughed off the idea of a monster in Enfield. It's probably just a dog with mange, they said, or maybe a prank. Kids these days will do anything for attention, but for every doubter, there was someone who believed. The local newspaper picked up the story, giving the creature its now famous name, the Enfield Monster. Headlines described Henry's sighting in vivid detail, quoting his chilling words, "If they do find it, they will find more than one. And they won't be from this planet, I can tell you that." The article also mentioned Greg Garrett's encounter, adding credibility to Henry's claims. Soon, the Enfield Monster wasn't just a local story, it was spreading to surrounding towns. Curiosity seekers began arriving in droves. Cars lined the streets near Henry's home, their headlights cutting through the darkness as people hoped to catch a glimpse of the creature. Some came with cameras, others with flashlights. A few brought guns, determined to hunt the monster themselves. The quiet town of Enfield was no longer quiet. For Henry and his family, the attention was overwhelming. Reporters knocked on their door at all hours. Neighbors stopped by to ask questions. and strangers lingered outside, pointing at the house where the encounter had taken place. Henry did his best to answer their questions, but his patience wore thin. "I know what I saw," he'd tell them. "You can believe me or not, but I'm telling the truth." His wife, on the other hand, stayed mostly silent. She was a private woman, and the sudden spotlight on their family made her uneasy. The children, too, were shaken. They'd heard the scratching at the door, seen the fear in their father's eyes. They didn't need convincing. But as the days passed, the story took on a life of its own. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some people claimed the creature was an alien, its ship hidden somewhere in the nearby woods. Others thought it might be a government experiment gone wrong, a hybrid of some kind, escaped from a lab. And then there were those who believed the creature was something far older, something tied to the land itself. The area around Enfield had a long history of strange tales. Stories of ghost lights, unexplained disappearances, and eerie sounds in the woods went back generations. Could the Enfield Monster be connected to these old legends? As the days turned into weeks, the excitement began to fade. The creature hadn't been seen again, at least not yet. But for the people of Enfield, life would never be the same. The question lingered in every shadow, every rustling leaf. Was it still out there? And if it was, would it return? Despite the police investigation and media attention, the Enfield Monster was never caught or even seen again. To this day, no explanation has been found. Skeptics argue that the sightings were nothing more than mass hysteria, fueled by fear and imagination. But believers point to the physical evidence: the scratches, the tracks, and the eyewitness accounts. What really happened in Enfield that night? Was it a hoax? A misidentified animal? Or was it something far more threatening? The story of the Enfield Monster remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in American history. Decades later, it still raises questions that have no answers. What was the creature with the glowing pink eyes? Where did it come from? And most haunting of all, could it still be out there, waiting in the shadows? Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones we see in movies, but the ones lurking just beyond the edge of the light.